Hello, U.S. history students. The last time we left off, we discussed why our first federal constitution, the Articles of Confederation, were not working out. In the summer of 1787, delegates from 12 of the 13 states converged in Philadelphia to try to revise the Articles. Instead, what they did was write a brand new constitution. Before we begin, let's know a few fun facts. As we just mentioned, the original purpose of the convention was to revise the Articles of Confederation. Remember, though, that any amendments to the Articles required unanimous vote, which was never going to happen. Instead, they ended up doing away with the Articles altogether. The meetings, which took place in what is now known as Independence Hall in Philadelphia, were held in secret. Technically, what the delegates were doing could be considered illegal. The only state that did not send representatives was Rhode Island. Some of the more well-known delegates were George Washington, who was chosen president of the convention, Alexander Hamilton, Ben Franklin, and James Madison, who was considered to be the main architect of the Constitution since he came up with much of the proposal. Although Madison's Virginia plan outlined much of what the new federal government would look like, several major compromises had to be reached in order to get enough states to ratify or adopt the new plan, which is why the Constitution is often referred to as a bundle of compromises. Madison's plan created three branches of government. The states would be represented in the legislative or lawmaking branch. The executive branch would enforce the laws, while the judicial branch would interpret the laws. We will talk more about the three branches in the next video lecture. The first compromise to be reached was the Great Compromise, and it dealt with how states would be represented in the legislative branch. The Virginia plan, favored by large states, called for a legislature in which states would be represented proportionally based on the size of their population. Under this plan, large states would receive more representatives. Small states feared that under this plan, they would constantly be outvoted. They proposed instead the New Jersey plan, in which each state would receive the same number of representatives. The two sides came to a compromise. The result of the Great Compromise was the creation of a bicameral or two-house legislature. In the lower house, the House of Representatives, also known as Congress, states would be represented proportionally. In the upper house, the Senate, each state would have two representatives regardless of its size. As soon as the Great Compromise resolved the issue of how states would be represented, another issue arose, and that was who counts towards a state's population. More specifically, do you count slaves? Southern states, of course, wanted to include slaves towards their population count, as that would give them more representatives in Congress. Northern states disagreed and felt that if slaves were property, slave owners should have to pay taxes on them. The result of this disagreement was the 3/5 Compromise. Under this plan, states could count 3/5 of their slaves towards both population and taxation purposes. The next compromise to be reached was the Commerce Compromise. The central issue in this compromise was granting the federal government the power to regulate interstate trade. Many agreed that the federal government needed to have this power, but it made some, especially in the South, uneasy. Southerners feared that this power would be used to impose import and export taxes, which would not benefit the Southern economy since it was mostly based on exporting cash crops and importing goods. Another thing Southerners feared was that this power would be used to regulate or even ban the slave trade. The resulting Commerce Compromise gave Congress the power to impose tariffs, taxes on imported goods, but Congress cannot tax exported goods. Also, the federal government cannot ban the importation of slaves until the year 1808. Many have criticized the Constitution for compromising on the issue of slavery. Interestingly enough, the document never uses the word slave until the ratification of the 13th Amendment in 1865, which banned it. Instead, the phrase other persons is used. However, it's important to keep in mind that at that time, the issue of slavery threatened to drive the southern states away from the convention, which would have resulted in no constitution at all. Instead, the founders created a system in which the issue could be addressed in the future. By September of 1787, the convention approved the final document and sent it to the states to be ratified, which required 9 of the 13. During the state ratification conventions, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison wrote a series of articles called the Federalist Papers, in which they argued for the wisdom of the Constitution by explaining its key principles. Since the Constitution granted the federal government much broader powers than the Articles of Confederation did, many people were opposed to its ratification. In order to satisfy the anti-federalists who felt the Constitution did not do enough to protect individual rights, 10 amendments were immediately proposed. These 10 amendments, referred to as the Bill of Rights, protect basic civil liberties such as the right to free speech, free press, trial by jury, and many others. More on them later. By July 1788, the required 9 states had ratified the Constitution. The Constitution was now the law of the land.